Minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not just a number on a thermometer. That is the temperature at which exposed skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. The temperature at which your breath turns to ice crystals before it ever leaves your lips. The temperature at which the Great Plains of North America become, by every modern measure, uninhabitable. And yet, for thousands of years, entire families slept warm through nights exactly like that. Not in concrete bunkers, not behind triple-pane glass, not with electric heaters humming in the corner. They slept inside structures made of wooden poles and animal hide. Structures that, by all logic, should have offered no protection at all. So what did they know that we have forgotten? Here at Primal Echoes, we go back. Back to the moments when human survival was not guaranteed, when every winter was a test, and when the solutions people built, with nothing but their hands, their observation, and their ancestors' whispered knowledge, turned out to be more sophisticated than anything a textbook would give them credit for. This is not a story about primitive shelters. This is a story about genius that looked simple on the outside and ran incredibly deep on the inside. Now, the first thing you need to understand is this. The Native Americans who survived those brutal plains winters did not survive by fighting the cold. They survived by understanding it. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. Modern engineering fights nature. It seals, it blocks, it overpowers. But these people listened. They watched how wind moved across open ground. They noticed where snow drifted and where it stayed still. They learned that the cold itself, if invited correctly, could become part of the solution. They did not build walls against winter. They built a conversation with it. In this video, we are going to reveal 3 engineering secrets hidden inside their winter dwellings. Secrets so effective that modern architects and NASA engineers have quietly rediscovered the same principles centuries later. But before we reveal the first secret, you need to understand the philosophy that made all of it possible. On the open plains of North America, a winter wind at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit does not simply chill you. It hunts you. It finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin, every crack in whatever shelter you thought was enough. There is no forest to break it, no hills to slow it down, just flat, frozen earth stretching to the horizon, and wind that has been building speed for 100 miles before it reaches you. And yet, the nomadic tribes of the Great Plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, did not hide from that wind. They built something that used it. That structure was the tepee, and it was far more than a tent made of sticks and skin. The foundation of every tepee was its frame, and the frame began with the poles. 12 to 20 of them, cut from lodgepole pine or mountain juniper, each one between 15 and 35 feet long, yet light enough for a single person to carry on horseback. The choice of wood was not random. These species grew naturally straight, with almost no taper and very few branches along the trunk. They were strong under compression, meaning they could bear tremendous downward weight without snapping, and yet flexible enough to sway in gusts without breaking. Every pole was the result of careful selection in the forest, sometimes searched for over miles, because a flawed pole could mean a collapsed home in the middle of February, at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. The installation always began with 3 or 4 of the longest poles tied securely together near the top, with a strip of rawhide, and then lifted and spread into a tripod. That tripod was everything. 3 contact points on the earth, no matter how uneven the ground, always create a stable base. The same principle engineers use in camera tripods and satellite dishes today. Once that foundation stood firm, the remaining poles were leaned into the junction at the top, one by one, fanning out in a wide circle until the full conical skeleton rose against the sky. Now here is the first thing that will genuinely surprise you. An entire camp, not one tepee, but dozens of them, a full village, could be completely dismantled, packed, and ready to move in under 60 minutes. Think about that for a moment. A modern family camping tent, the kind you buy at an outdoor store, takes the average person 30 to 45 minutes to pitch for the first time. These families were assembling complex, weather-sealed, thermally efficient homes, and tearing them down, faster than that. That was not luck. That was 1,000 years of refinement. Once the frame was standing, it was time for the cover. And this is where the true cost of a tepee reveals itself. A single-family tepee required the hides of 12 to 18 bison. Not just any hides. Hides that had been processed through one of the most labor-intensive material treatments in human history. After the hunt, each hide was stretched flat on the ground and staked down. The women of the tribe scraped away every trace of fat and flesh, using tools made from bone and stone, then left the skin to dry hard under the sun. After that, the hair was removed through soaking and a second round of scraping. Then came tanning, rubbing the hide with a mixture made from the animal's own brain and liver, working it deep into the fibers, then pulling and kneading and stretching the skin across a rope or log for days, until it transformed from a stiff, brittle sheet into something soft and supple as suede, cream-colored, water-resistant, and extraordinarily durable. When you understand what went into each single hide, you begin to understand what the finished cover truly meant. The women of the tribe spent entire autumns on this work, stitching the treated hides together with thread made from animal sinew, each stitch tightening as it dried, forming seams so strong they became virtually waterproof. Every needle length of sinew pulled through that leather was, in its own quiet way, a promise. A promise that when the temperature outside dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind came hunting across the open plain, the walls of that home would hold. The cover was not just material. It was the most valuable thing a family owned. Poles could be found in any forest, but a cover like that represented months of skilled labor, and losing it could mean losing everything. But here is what you need to know. The cover and the poles were only half the story. The real genius of the tepee was invisible. It was hidden not in the wood, not in the hide, but in the air itself. And that is exactly where we are going next. So the poles were set. The cover was stretched and pinned. From the outside, a tepee looked like a simple cone of hide standing on frozen ground. But what was happening inside that structure? What was happening in the air inside that structure was anything but simple. This is where we get to the three secrets. And the first one is at the very top. At the peak of every tepee, where all the poles converged, there was an opening for smoke to escape. But it was not just a hole. Attached to the outside of the cover at that opening were two large triangular flaps, one on each side, each controlled by its own separate pole that the people inside could adjust from the ground without ever stepping out into the cold. Those flaps were the first secret. By angling them in response to the wind direction, the occupants created a controlled draft that pulled smoke up and out of the structure with remarkable efficiency, regardless of which way the wind was blowing. No chimney pipe, no mechanical damper, no electricity, just two pieces of hide on poles, positioned with knowledge. In a blizzard at -30 degrees Fahrenheit, when a single mistake in smoke management could mean suffocation, or a fire that burned the entire home down, those flaps gave families precise, reliable control over their indoor air. That is not primitive. That is elegant engineering. The second secret lived lower, along the inner walls. Attached to the poles from the inside, running all the way around the perimeter of the tepee, was a separate liner, called the ozan, in Lakota. It was a wide curtain of hide or canvas, roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, that hung away from the outer cover by several inches, never touching it. That gap, that column of still air trapped between two layers of material, was the second secret. Cold air seeping under the outer cover's edge could not reach the living space directly. Instead, it rose through that gap, drawn upward by the heat inside, and exited through the smoke hole at the top. Meanwhile, the trapped air between the two layers acted as insulation in exactly the same way that modern double-glazed windows work, a principle that architects in the 20th century celebrated as an innovation. The people of the plains were using it 500 years earlier. They invented double-wall insulation before modern science gave it a name. The third secret was the shape itself. A cone is not just an aesthetic choice. It is a thermodynamic machine. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, entered naturally at the base of the structure. The central fire heated it, and as it warmed, it rose along the sloping walls toward the peak. As it exited through the smoke hole, it created a slight negative pressure that pulled fresh air in from below, which the fire then heated, which rose again, which pulled in more fresh air. A continuous, self-sustaining loop of air movement, feeding the fire, removing smoke, and distributing warmth across the entire interior. No fan, no pump, no moving parts, just physics, understood completely and used deliberately. And the result of these three systems working together was this. On a night when the temperature outside dropped to -35 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature inside a well-managed tepee could hold at 50 to 60 degrees above zero. A difference of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, produced by animal hide, wooden poles, and trapped air. But now consider this question. Not every tribe followed the bison across open plains. Some people lived in places where the wind was already broken, where ancient forests pressed close, and the ground stayed frozen but sheltered. What did survival look like for them? The answer looked nothing like a tepee, and it worked just as brilliantly. The Algonquian peoples of the northeastern woodlands built the wigwam, a dome-shaped structure whose frame was made not from straight poles, but from living saplings of maple, willow, and elm, bent by hand into graceful arcs and tied together into a lattice that could bear the weight of heavy winter snow without collapsing. Over this frame they laid sheets of birch bark, harvested in spring when the sap made it pliable, and overlapped like tiles on a roof. Birch bark contains natural resins and waxes in its cellular structure that make it completely impermeable to water, yet it allows water vapor to pass through, preventing condensation from building up on the interior walls and keeping the air inside dry and breathable. It is a membrane so precisely calibrated between waterproofing and breathability that modern outdoor gear engineers, developing fabrics like Gore-Tex in the 20th century, found themselves studying the same structural principles that birch trees had solved millions of years before them. In winter, the wigwam was wrapped in multiple overlapping layers, bark on the outside, woven cattail mats underneath, and sometimes an inner lining of animal skins, each layer trapping its own column of air, multiplying the insulation effect, not by addition, but by multiplication. Now you understand how they built the walls. But what happened inside those walls? That is where survival became something else entirely. Step inside. The entrance faces east, always east, toward the first light of morning. And as you duck through the hide door and straighten up inside, the world outside ceases to exist. The -40 degrees Fahrenheit wind, the blowing snow, the howling darkness, all of it stops at that threshold. What replaces it is firelight. At the center of the floor, slightly forward of the geometric middle, to allow smoke a cleaner path to the vent above, a fire burns low and steady. And that fire was not simply a heat source. It was everything. It was the family's kitchen, their lamp, their gathering place, their clock, and their altar. Smoke rising from it carried prayers upward. Stories told beside it carried knowledge forward. Children falling asleep watching its light were absorbing the history of their people without a single word being written down. Every culture on Earth that has ever survived a winter has understood fire as sacred. But the people who lived inside these structures understood it with a particular depth, because without it, at -40 degrees Fahrenheit outside, death would come within hours. Now look at the floor beneath your feet. What you are standing on is not bare earth. It is a system. First, a thick layer of dried grass laid directly on the compacted ground for moisture barrier and cushion. On top of that, a layer of pine branches, their natural oils releasing a scent that kept insects away, and their springy structure adding lift. Over that, woven mats of cattail or reed for smoothness. And finally, spread across everything, the heavy furs of bear or bison, hair side up, thick enough to sleep on in comfort at any temperature. 5 layers between your body and frozen ground. 5 layers of survival wisdom, each one doing a job the one beneath it could not do alone. The sleeping platforms built around the inner perimeter took that logic one step further. Raised 8 to 12 inches above the floor on a frame of branches and poles, those platforms were not about comfort in the way we think of comfort today. They were about physics. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. It pools at the lowest point in any enclosed space, which means the coldest layer of air in the tepee was always the layer closest to the ground. By sleeping elevated, even by less than a foot, a person escaped the coldest band of air entirely and rested in a layer several degrees warmer. They understood that cold air sinks centuries before physics textbooks were written. The winterization of the structure itself was equally deliberate. Around the base of the tepee, where the outer cover met the ground, heavy stones and logs were laid along the entire perimeter, pressing the hide tight against the earth so that no gap remained for wind to push through. Then, snow, which is approximately 90% trapped air by volume and one of the finest natural insulators in existence, was piled deliberately against the outside walls, sometimes reaching a meter high. What looked from the outside like simple snowdrift was in fact intentional insulation, the same principle used in modern spray foam sealant, applied by hand and replenished after every storm. The entrance was protected by a short vestibule, a small enclosed tunnel of hide and branches, 1 to 2 meters long, built in front of the main door. Anyone entering had to pass through that buffer zone first, which meant the cold air they brought in with them dissipated in the vestibule, rather than pouring directly into the living space. It was an airlock, centuries before that word existed. Outside, at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the blizzard raged without mercy. Inside, the fire crackled. The pine needles released their scent. A grandmother's voice carried a story across the firelight to the children lying warm in their furs. The storm raged. They thrived. And in the longhouses of the Iroquois nations further east, this idea of communal warmth was taken to its most ambitious expression. Structures stretching up to 300 feet in length, housing dozens of families under a single arched bark roof, with multiple fires burning along a central corridor, each one tended by a different family, the combined heat of all of them turning the entire building into something that functioned like a single breathing organism. The first apartment building in the Americas was not made of concrete and steel. It was made of bent saplings and elm bark, and it kept hundreds of people alive through winters that modern people would not survive unequipped for a single night. And yet, none of this was only about survival. Every pole, every hide, every flame carried a meaning far deeper than warmth. And that is exactly where we are going now. Every element of the tepee carried meaning beyond its function. The floor was not just packed earth, it was Mother Earth herself, the foundation of all life, the source from which everything grew and to which everything returned. The poles rising from the ground and converging at the sky were not just structural supports, they were pathways, connections between the world of the living and the world of the spirit, between what could be seen and what could only be felt. The fire at the center was not simply a heat source, it was the heart of the home, the pulse that kept the family alive, and the smoke that rose from it was a message sent upward, carrying the prayers and gratitude of the people outward into something larger than themselves. And the circular shape of the base, without corners, without beginning, without end, reflected the shape of the sun, the moon, the horizon, and the cycle of every life ever lived. Nothing in that structure was accidental. Everything spoke. What is remarkable, genuinely remarkable, is that when NASA engineers in the 20th century began designing life support systems for long-duration space habitation, the core challenges they faced were the same ones a Lakota family solved every winter on the open plains. Multi-layer thermal insulation to prevent heat loss in extreme cold. Closed-loop air circulation to remove carbon dioxide and maintain breathable atmosphere. Condensation management to keep interior walls dry. Structural efficiency under load with minimum material weight. Every one of those principles, every single one, was embedded in the design of structures built from wooden poles and animal hide, 500 years before the first rocket ever left the ground. Not because those people had access to laboratories or mathematics or engineering degrees, but because they had something that no laboratory can manufacture. They had thousands of years of unbroken observation, thousands of winters of learning what worked and passing it forward, generation to generation, in the form of knowledge so refined it looked effortless from the outside. They had no blueprints, no engineers, no electricity. They had something far more powerful, thousands of years of listening to the earth, and the earth answered. If this kind of story speaks to you, if you want to go deeper into how ancient peoples survived the impossible, how the Vikings engineered warmth through the darkest winters in Scandinavia, how the Athabascan people of interior Alaska built homes that functioned at -60 degrees Fahrenheit, how every civilization that endured left behind a blueprint written not in paper but in wood and stone and bone, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to Primal Echoes. Leave a comment below telling us which civilization you want us to explore next. Because the past is not behind us. It is still speaking. We just have to be willing to listen.